7 graves, 7 tiny coffins, 7 children who never saw their 3rd birthday. In 1872, the townspeople of Lawrence, Kansas whispered that Mary Catherine Walsh was cursed by God himself. But the truth buried in those shallow graves was far more terrifying than any curse. The first child died on a Tuesday. Little James, barely 18 months old, convulsing in his mother's arms as black bile poured from his mouth. The town doctor, Heinrich Brenner, recorded the cause as sudden fever and closed his leather-bound journal with trembling hands. What he didn't write down would haunt Lawrence for decades. Mary Catherine Walsh arrived in Lawrence, Kansas in the spring of 1867, a fresh-faced bride of 19, with cornflower blue eyes and dreams of raising a large family on the American frontier. Her husband, Patrick Walsh, had secured work at the grain mill, and together they built a modest 2-room cabin on the outskirts of town, where the prairie grass danced in endless waves beneath the enormous Kansas sky. The young couple seemed blessed. Patrick was strong and hard-working. Mary Catherine was beloved by the church ladies for her gentle nature and beautiful singing voice. When she announced her first pregnancy in late 1867, the entire community celebrated. Children were precious on the frontier, where families needed strong hands to work the land and carry on the family name. But something was wrong from the very beginning. James Patrick Walsh was born on March 15, 1868, after a labor so difficult that the midwife, old Mrs. Henderson, crossed herself 3 times and muttered prayers in her native German. The baby seemed healthy enough at first, pink and squalling, with a full head of dark hair like his father. But as the months passed, troubling signs began to emerge. The child would not gain weight properly, despite Mary Catherine's desperate attempts to nurse him. His skin took on a peculiar pallor, almost translucent, so that the blue veins showed clearly beneath. Most disturbing of all were his eyes. They seemed too large for his small face and held an expression of ancient sadness that unnerved even the hardened frontier women who came to visit. By his first birthday, little James could barely sit upright without support. The town doctor, Heinrich Brenner, examined the boy multiple times but could find nothing obviously wrong. Some children are simply delicate. The frontier life is hard. Not all are meant to survive it. But James did survive his first year, and his second. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the family's prayers had been answered. The boy began to walk, though unsteadily, and even started to speak a few words. Mary Catherine dared to hope. Then came that terrible Tuesday in September of 1870. James woke before dawn, his small body burning with fever. By noon he was convulsing. By evening he was dead. The last sounds he made were not the cries of a child, but something else entirely. A rasping, choking noise that would echo in Mary Catherine's nightmares for years to come. Dr. Brenner arrived too late to help, but not too late to observe. What he saw in that dimly lit cabin would change everything, though he wouldn't understand the full implications for months to come. The second child, Margaret Rose Walsh, was born exactly 9 months after James's death. Mary Catherine had become pregnant again almost immediately, as if compelled by some desperate need to replace what she had lost. The townspeople whispered that it was too soon, that she should have waited, that grief could poison a growing baby. They had no idea how right they were. Margaret Rose Walsh entered the world on June 10, 1871, in the same cabin where her brother had died. The birth was even more difficult than the first, and this time Dr. Brenner was present to witness the horror firsthand. The baby emerged not pink and healthy, but with that same translucent skin, those same enormous, haunted eyes. And something else. Something that made the good doctor step back from the bed and reach instinctively for the silver cross around his neck. The child's fingernails were black. Not dirty black, not bruised black, but a deep, uniform black that extended to the quick. When Dr. Brenner examined them more closely with his magnifying glass, he could see tiny dark veins running beneath the nail beds like poisonous rivers. "Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, pulling Patrick aside, "has your wife been eating anything unusual during the pregnancy? Any herbs or tonics?" Patrick shook his head. "Nothing different than what she ate with James. Why? Is something wrong with the baby?"
Dr. Brenner looked at the infant again. Margaret Rose was quiet, too quiet. Most newborns cried lustily, announcing their arrival to the world. This child lay still and silent, those two large eyes staring up at the ceiling as if seeing something the adults could not. "I'm not sure," the doctor admitted, "but I think we should watch her very carefully." They watched. The entire town watched. And what they saw defied every law of nature and medicine that Dr. Brenner had learned in his 25 years of practice. Margaret Rose grew, but wrong. Her limbs remained thin and weak, her belly distended like a starving child's, yet she ate constantly. Mary Catherine would nurse her for hours at a time, and still the infant would cry with hunger. Neighbors began bringing food, milk from their best cows, eggs from their healthiest hens, even precious white flour for making soft bread. Nothing satisfied her. By her first birthday, Margaret Rose could not walk or even sit properly. Her hair, which had started dark like her brother's, began to fall out in patches, leaving strange bald spots that never grew back. The black fingernails grew longer and longer, no matter how often Mary Catherine tried to trim them, and the child began to make sounds. Not normal baby sounds, gurgles and coos and cries. These were different, low, throaty noises that seemed to come from deep in her chest. The church ladies who visited said it sounded like she was trying to speak, but in a language none of them recognized. Dr. Brenner began keeping detailed notes, though he shared them with no one. He measured the child's growth, documented her symptoms, and slowly began to piece together a pattern that chilled him to the bone. On a cold February morning in 1873, Margaret Rose Walsh died in her sleep. She was 20 months old. This time, Dr. Brenner insisted on performing an examination of the body before burial. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The child's organs were wrong. Not diseased exactly, but different. Her heart was smaller than it should have been, her liver enlarged and discolored. Most disturbing of all, her stomach contained a substance he had never seen before, a thick, black liquid that smelled of copper and decay. He took samples, sealed them in glass vials, and locked them away in his medical bag. Then he went home and drank whiskey until he could no longer remember the look in that dead child's eyes. The third pregnancy was announced in the spring of 1873, just 2 months after Margaret Rose's death. This time the townspeople did not celebrate. They gathered in small groups and whispered. They crossed themselves when Mary Catherine walked by. Some of the more superstitious families began avoiding the Walsh cabin altogether. "It ain't natural," old Mrs. Henderson told her daughter-in-law. "A woman shouldn't be able to get with child so quick after losing one. There's something unholy about it." But Mary Catherine seemed oblivious to the whispers. If anything, she appeared more radiant than ever during this third pregnancy. Her pale skin took on a healthy glow. Her hair grew thick and lustrous. She sang while she worked in her garden, tending vegetables that grew larger and more abundant than anyone else's in town. But Patrick was changing. The loss of 2 children had aged him prematurely. His dark hair was shot through with silver. Deep lines had carved themselves around his eyes, and he had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking and rechecking the locks on their cabin doors. "I've been thinking," he told his wife one evening as she knitted tiny clothes for the coming baby. "Maybe we should move, start fresh somewhere else. Kansas is hard on children." Mary Catherine looked up from her knitting, and for just a moment, Patrick saw something flicker across her face, something cold and hungry. "The children are buried here," she said simply. "I can't leave them." When Thomas Michael Walsh was born on December 3, 1873, Dr. Brenner was ready. He had spent months preparing, reading every medical text he could find, corresponding with colleagues in Boston and New York. He was determined to save this child, to break whatever curse or illness was claiming the Walsh babies. But Thomas was born wrong, just like his siblings. The same translucent skin, the same enormous eyes, the same black fingernails, and something new, something that made Dr. Brenner's blood run cold. The baby was born with teeth, not the tiny harmless nubs that sometimes appeared in newborns, but a full set of sharp, pointed teeth that looked more suited to a predator than a human infant. When Mary Catherine tried to nurse him, he bit her so savagely that she bled. "This is impossible," Dr. Brenner muttered, examining the baby's mouth with shaking hands. "Children aren't born with teeth like this. It goes against nature." But Mary Catherine seemed unfazed. She simply wrapped the bite wounds on her breast and continued caring for the child as if nothing was amiss. When neighbors came to visit, she would cover the baby's face with a blanket and explain that he was sleeping.
Thomas lived for 13 months, longer than either of his siblings, but his life was a horror that defied description. He grew rapidly, but wrong, his limbs elongating unnaturally, his fingers stretching until they looked more like claws than human hands. The black fingernails grew so long that they curved back on themselves, and no amount of trimming seemed to slow their growth. The child never learned to walk, but he could move with frightening speed when he wanted to. Neighbors reported seeing him crawling across the cabin floor with inhuman grace, those terrible teeth gleaming in the lamplight. And he was always hungry. Mary Catherine would feed him constantly, not just milk, but solid food that no normal infant could digest. Strips of raw meat, whole eggs, even soil from the garden. He would devour everything with those razor-sharp teeth and still cry for more. Dr. Brenner visited the cabin regularly, documenting Thomas's development with growing horror. The boy's behavior was becoming increasingly disturbing. He would stare at visitors with those huge, knowing eyes and make that same throaty sound they had heard from Margaret Rose. But now it was louder, more insistent, almost like words. On a January evening in 1875, Thomas Michael Walsh died, but unlike his siblings, his death was not peaceful. Mary Catherine's screams could be heard 3 miles away. When Dr. Brenner arrived at the cabin, he found Patrick holding his wife as she sobbed hysterically. The baby lay in his cradle, but something was wrong with the scene. The blankets were shredded, as if by claws. Dark stains covered the wooden cradle sides. "What happened?" Dr. Brenner demanded. Patrick's face was white as the snow outside. He fought it. Whatever takes them, he fought it. But in the end, the doctor approached the cradle with trembling hands. Thomas lay still and silent, but his face was contorted in an expression of rage that no 13-month-old child should be capable of. His hands were clenched into fists, and his mouth was open, revealing those terrible teeth. But it was his eyes that would haunt Dr. Brenner's nightmares. They were completely black. If you're finding this as disturbing as I am, drop a comment and let me know what state you're watching from. The story gets even darker from here. The fourth child, Catherine Ann, was born in the autumn of 1875. By this time, the town of Lawrence had effectively ostracized the Walsh family. No one would visit their cabin anymore. The local minister refused to baptize the children. Even the hardiest frontier women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw Mary Catherine approaching. But Mary Catherine didn't seem to notice or care. If anything, she appeared more content than ever. Her garden flourished while her neighbors' crops failed. Her chickens laid more eggs than any others in town. The cow Patrick had bought from a local farmer produced rich, creamy milk in quantities that defied explanation. It was as if the land itself was blessing her with abundance. Dr. Brenner had begun to suspect that the blessings came with a terrible price. Catherine Ann was born different from her siblings in one crucial way. She was beautiful, not the pale, sickly beauty that had marked the other children, but genuinely lovely, with rosy cheeks and bright, clear eyes. For the first time in years, Dr. Brenner allowed himself to hope. "She looks healthy," he told Patrick after examining the newborn. "Truly healthy. Perhaps this time—" But his optimism was short-lived. Within days of her birth, Catherine Ann began to change. The rosy cheeks faded to that familiar translucent pallor. The bright eyes grew larger and darker, and the black fingernails appeared, growing with alarming speed. This child, however, was different in other ways. She was smart, unnaturally smart. By 6 months, she could understand complex instructions. By 9 months, she was speaking in full sentences. By her first birthday, she was reading from her mother's Bible, and she was asking questions that no child should know to ask. "Mama," she said one evening as Mary Catherine tucked her into bed, "when will the man come for me?" Mary Catherine's hand froze on the blanket. "What man, sweetheart?" "The tall man with the dark coat. He comes for us all eventually. James told me, and Margaret Rose, and Thomas." Dr. Brenner was present for this conversation, having been called to examine Catherine Ann for a persistent cough. The child's words sent ice through his veins. "Catherine," he said gently, "you can't remember your brothers and sister. You were born after they died." The little girl turned those enormous dark eyes on him, and when she smiled, he could see that her teeth were beginning to sharpen. "I remember everything, Dr. Brenner. I remember being James. I remember being Margaret Rose. I remember being Thomas. And soon I'll remember being someone new." The doctor stumbled backwards, his medical bag falling to the floor with a crash.
"That's impossible," he whispered. Catherine Ann tilted her head, and for a moment
She looked exactly like her mother. Nothing is impossible, Dr. Brenner. You should know that by now. 3 days later, Catherine Ann Walsh was found dead in her cradle. But unlike her siblings, her body was not alone. Mary Catherine lay beside the crib, apparently dead as well. Patrick found them both when he returned from town, and his screams brought Dr. Brenner running. But when the doctor arrived, Mary Catherine was alive. She sat beside the crib, cradling her dead daughter, humming a lullaby in a language he didn't recognize. Her eyes were completely black, just like Thomas's had been at the end. "Mary Catherine," he said carefully. She looked up at him and smiled. For a moment, her eyes flickered back to their normal blue. "Hello, Heinrich," she said in her normal voice. "I'm afraid we've lost another one." The next morning, she was pregnant again. The pattern continued, child after child, each born wrong, each living just long enough to develop those terrible symptoms before dying in increasingly disturbing ways. The fifth child, Patrick Jr., was born with bones so soft they bent like rubber. The sixth, Sarah Elizabeth, grew backwards, getting smaller and younger looking until she was the size of a newborn, despite being nearly 2 years old. By 1879, 7 years after James's first death, Dr. Brenner had filled 3 leathered journals with his observations. He had corresponded with colleagues across the country, sent samples to laboratories in New York and Boston, even consulted with professors at Harvard Medical School. No one could explain what was happening to the Walsh children, but Dr. Brenner had begun to form his own theories that he dared not share with anyone for fear they would think him mad. The 7th child, Rebecca Hope, was born on a stormy night in October 1879. Dr. Brenner had sworn he would not attend another Walsh birth, but Mary Catherine had sent Patrick to fetch him with such urgency that he couldn't refuse. When he arrived at the cabin, he found Mary Catherine in the final stages of labor, but something was different this time. The air in the cabin felt thick and oppressive, like the moments before a tornado strikes. The flames in the oil lamps flickered and danced despite the absence of any wind, and Mary Catherine was not screaming in pain as women in labor normally did. She was laughing. Rebecca Hope Walsh was born at the stroke of midnight as thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the cabin windows. Unlike her siblings, she emerged not crying, but singing, a wordless melody that made Dr. Brenner's teeth ache and his vision blur. The baby was perfect. No translucent skin, no black fingernails, no enormous eyes. She looked like any healthy newborn, pink and plump and normal. Dr. Brenner should have been relieved. Instead, he was more terrified than ever, because Mary Catherine was no longer laughing. She lay on the blood-soaked sheets, staring at her newborn daughter with an expression of pure hunger. "She's the one," Mary Catherine whispered. "After all these years, she's finally the one." "The one what?" Dr. Brenner demanded. Mary Catherine's head turned toward him with unnatural smoothness, and when she spoke, her voice was layered with harmonics that hurt to hear. "The one strong enough to hold us all." Rebecca Hope lived for exactly 23 months and 14 days. Dr. Brenner counted every one of them, because he spent that entire time documenting the most horrifying case study of his career. The child grew normally at first, hitting all the expected milestones. She walked on time, spoke her first words at the appropriate age, even began to show the sweet, gentle personality that once characterized her mother. But as her second birthday approached, changes began to manifest. Not the familiar symptoms that had marked her siblings, but something far more disturbing. Rebecca Hope began to remember things she had never experienced. "Mama, remember when I was Thomas and I bit Dr. Brenner's finger?" Her
her hand stilled on the brush. "You were never Thomas, sweetheart. Thomas was your brother. I was Thomas and James and Margaret Rose and Catherine Ann and Patrick Jr. and Sarah Elizabeth." The little girl recited the names like a prayer. "We all live inside me now, Mama, all of us together." Dr. Brenner, who had been present for this conversation, felt his blood turn to ice. He had suspected something like this might be happening, but hearing it confirmed by the child herself was almost more than his sanity could bear. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what do you remember about being your brothers and sisters?" The little girl turned those clear, innocent eyes on him, and when she smiled, he saw not one child, but 7, all looking out through the same face.
"I remember dying, Dr. Brenner, over and over and over. Each time, Mama would be so sad, and each time the man in the dark coat would come and take us away. But this time is different." "Different how?" "This time, I'm strong enough to say no." On a cold February morning in 1881, Rebecca Hope Walsh died in her sleep, just like all her siblings before her. But when Dr. Brenner arrived to examine the body, he found something that defied every law of nature and medicine he had ever known. The child was still warm, not just warm, but alive in some fundamental way that his instruments couldn't measure. Her heart wasn't beating, her lungs weren't drawing breath, but something vital and essential still animated her small form. "She's not really dead, is she?" he asked Mary Catherine. The woman stood beside the crib, no longer the young bride who had arrived in Lawrence 14 years earlier. Her hair was white as snow, her face lined with premature age, her once blue eyes now permanently black as midnight. "None of them are really dead, Heinrich," she said, in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "They're all here with me, and with her, forever." As if responding to her words, Rebecca Hope's eyes opened. She sat up in her crib and looked directly at Dr. Brenner. "Hello, doctor," she said, in a voice that held echoes of all 7 children. "Would you like to know the truth?" Dr. Brenner found himself nodding, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "Mama made a bargain," Rebecca Hope continued, climbing out of her crib with fluid grace. "Before James was born, when she was so afraid of losing her babies to the harsh frontier life, she prayed to anyone who would listen to keep her children safe. And someone answered," Mary Catherine said, her voice hollow with the weight of terrible knowledge. "The man in the dark coat." Rebecca Hope nodded. "He promised that her children would never truly die, that they would always be with her. But every gift has a price." "What price?" Dr. Brenner whispered. The little girl smiled, and in that smile was the accumulated hunger of 7 dead children and their damned mother. Their souls, and eventually the souls of everyone they touch. Dr. Brenner ran. He left his medical bag, his instruments, his carefully documented journals, and ran from that cabin as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't stop running until he reached the train station, and he didn't stop moving until he was on the other side of the country. He never practiced medicine again. The Walsh cabin still stands on the outskirts of Lawrence, Kansas, though the town has grown around it over the decades. The city council has tried to demolish it several times, but something always goes wrong with the demolition crews. Equipment breaks down, workers get sick, accidents happen. Local historians say the cabin has been empty since 1881, when the Walsh family simply vanished one night, leaving behind only 7 small graves in the backyard and the lingering scent of something that might have been roses
if roses could smell of copper and regret. But people who live in the neighborhood tell different stories. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, you can see lights in the cabin windows. You can hear the sound of children playing in the yard, and a woman's voice singing lullabies in a language that predates human speech. And sometimes, just sometimes, you can see them standing at the windows. A woman with white hair and black eyes, surrounded by 7 children who flicker in and out of existence like candles in the wind. They're still there, locals whisper, still waiting, still hungry. The question that haunts me and should haunt you is this: how many families across America made similar bargains? How many mothers, desperate to protect their children from the harsh realities of the frontier life, opened doors that should have remained forever closed? And how many of those doors are still open today? The records show that Dr. Heinrich Brenner died in San Francisco in 1923, an old man who spoke frequently of his regrets but never specified what they were. His personal effects included 3 leather journals filled with medical observations and 7 glass vials containing a black substance that no laboratory could identify. The vials were donated to the University of California Medical School, where they remain in storage to this day. According to the inventory records, the substance in the vials continues to move and shift despite being nearly 150 years old. Some things, it seems, refuse to die. If this story has left you with questions that science can't answer, you're in the right place. Every week, we dig deep into the dark corners of medical history, uncovering stories that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the thin line between them. These aren't just tales from the past. They're warnings about what happens when we let desperation override wisdom, when we make bargains with forces we don't understand. The truth is, Mary Catherine Walsh's story isn't unique. Across America, families made similar choices when faced with impossible circumstances. The frontier was lethal. Children died young and often. And sometimes, in their desperation, parents opened doors that should have remained forever closed. What do you think happened to the Walsh family after they disappeared? Are there other families out there still paying the price for bargains made generations ago? Share your theories in the comments, and if you know of similar cases in your area, I want to hear about them. Next week, we're investigating the Riverside Sanitarium incident of 1893, where an entire ward of patients vanished overnight, leaving behind only their shadows burned into the walls. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Until then, remember, some secrets are buried for a reason, but that's never stopped us from digging them up.